The human brain is not just a thinking organ. It's a deeply social organ. From the moment we're born, our brains are wired to seek connection. This connection is not philosophical or abstract. It is biochemical. Oxytocin, often referred to as the bonding hormone, plays a major role in building emotional attachment. When we form close relationships, our brains release oxytocin during moments of physical closeness, eye contact, trust, and shared experience. That chemical surge reinforces our sense of connection and trust with others. It's one of the reasons why letting go of someone, whether it's a partner, friend, or family member, can feel so painful. You're not just making a decision to step away mentally, you are disrupting a neurochemical feedback loop that has been reinforcing that relationship every single day. But what happens when that loop becomes maladaptive? Relationships that create chronic stress, feelings of inadequacy, emotional volatility, or codependence alter the brain's chemistry in a different way. Prolonged exposure to emotional stress leads to elevated levels of cortisol, the brain's primary stress hormone. Cortisol, when sustained over long periods, shrinks the hippocampus, an area responsible for memory and emotional regulation, and disrupts communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. This means you become less able to make logical decisions and more reactive, impulsive, and emotionally unstable. Essentially, your brain begins to function in survival mode rather than in growth mode. The prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function, planning, and long-term thinking, starts to lose control. Instead, the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, takes over. When you're overly attached to someone who is no longer beneficial to your life, your brain's decision-making systems become compromised. You're no longer evaluating the relationship based on growth, purpose, or alignment. You're evaluating it based on fear. Fear of loneliness, fear of the unknown, fear of breaking the attachment loop. And fear, when allowed to persist, becomes the dominant signal that shapes your behavior. Letting go of someone is not a betrayal of love or loyalty. It is an act of neurobiological self-preservation. It allows your brain to recalibrate. When the stimulus, this person, this relationship, is removed, the brain experiences a withdrawal period. There may be sadness, confusion, or even physical symptoms of distress. This is expected. It's similar to the neural response seen during addiction withdrawal. Why? Because relationships can become addictive. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation and craving, is also involved in social bonding. Every time we receive validation, attention, or emotional intimacy from another person, dopamine is released. If that reward becomes inconsistent, it doesn't go away. In fact, it becomes more potent. This is known as intermittent reinforcement, and it creates one of the most powerful behavioral feed loops in psychology. The brain becomes obsessed with seeking closure, clarity, or another hit of connection, even from a source that repeatedly causes pain. So, to let go is to interrupt that loop. It's to say, this stimulus no longer serves my brain, my well-being, or my future. That kind of cognitive reappraisal, rewriting the narrative around why you are letting go, activates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This region is essential for reframing thoughts and resisting urges. By practicing detachment, by reinforcing a new story around your self-worth and boundaries, you begin to strengthen the circuitry that allows for emotional independence. Moreover, letting go creates space, literally and figuratively. Without the cognitive load of emotional stress, the brain has more capacity for learning, creativity, and clarity. The default mode network, the part of the brain active during rest and self-reflection, becomes less hyperactive in repetitive loops of rumination. This quieting of internal noise allows for deeper introspection, leading to better decisions and a more coherent sense of self. The reality is, if you keep holding on to someone who isn't holding on to you, or worse, someone who is actively damaging your sense of peace, you are reinforcing neural pathways that lead to emotional instability and diminished focus. Every thought you allow to circle back to them becomes a vote for a brain state you don't want to stay in. And because the brain changes through repetition, that state can become a trait. It becomes who you are unless you break the pattern, unless you make the conscious decision to reroute the circuitry, unless you choose over and over again to focus on yourself and let them go. Attention is the gateway to everything you experience in life. Every thought, every emotion, every habit is downstream of what you pay attention to. It is not a passive feature of the brain. Attention is an active, trainable mechanism that determines your reality. In neuroscience, this is referred to as top-down control, where your prefrontal cortex decides what signals from the external world and your internal world deserve priority. But here's the challenging: attention is limited. You cannot attend to everything. And if your attention is consumed by people, memories that no longer serve your growth, you are handing over the most valuable resource your brain has. The brain is constantly scanning for signals of relevance. Emotional triggers, unresolved conflicts, and familiar relationships, especially those that are emotionally intense, capture your attention because they've been wired into your salience network. This network determines what your brain deems important, even if it's not beneficial. When you obsessively think about someone you're trying to let go of, you're reinforcing neural circuits that elevate their importance in your cognitive hierarchy. Over time, this becomes automatic. You don't choose to think about them. Your brain defaults to it. And the more you do it, the deeper those neural grooves become. The key is to take back conscious control. Redirecting attention is not about distraction. It's about relocation. Your brain thrives when it's aligned with meaningful goals, intentional practices, and clear direction. Tools like breathwork, mindfulness, and journaling are not just trendy habits. They are mechanisms for regaining control over attentional systems. For example, focused breathing, especially through the nose, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, calming the mind and creating space between stimulus and response. That space is where attention can be reoriented. Another powerful mechanism is what neuroscientists call attentional anchoring. This involves deliberately choosing an object of focus, your breath, a mantra, a goal, and training your mind to return to it whenever distraction occurs. Over time, this trains the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in attention switching and conflict resolution, to strengthen focus and diminish the influence of intrusive thoughts. If you're constantly pulled toward thoughts of someone you need to let go of, this technique allows you to gradually reduce their salience in your mental landscape. People often underestimate the cognitive cost of mental clutter. Every unregulated thought consumes glucose, the brain's energy source. When attention is fragmented between past pain and present tasks, performance suffers. Emotional regulation decreases, decision-making becomes impaired, and stress increases. Your brain is less able to differentiate between what's urgent and what's just familiar. And familiarity, especially in relationships, is not the same as value. Many individuals stay mentally attached to people out of a sense of emotional inertia, not alignment. That inertia keeps the brain tethered to a version of the self that no longer fits its future. The frontal lobe, responsible for planning and long-term vision, cannot function optimally when attention is hijacked by emotional residue. To move forward, the brain needs clarity. Clarity comes from sustained attention toward constructive behaviors. Learning, exercising, creating, building something bigger than the loss. When you start pouring attention into yourself, your goals, your routines, your sleep, your nutrition, you begin to rewire the brain's reward system. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation and drive, becomes associated not with the person you're letting go of, but with the progress you're making alone. Even your internal dialogue changes when you redirect attention. Language centers in the brain, such as Broca's and Wernicke's areas, are heavily influenced by where attention is placed. If you're constantly narrating a story of loss, abandonment, or betrayal, that becomes your brain's script. But when attention shifts to empowerment, purpose, and self-direction, new language patterns emerge. This shift in internal dialogue is not just symbolic. It restructures neural pathways through repetition, leading to greater emotional regulation and cognitive coherence. Digital environments must also be considered. Social media, photo memories, message threads, these are digital extensions of your attention. They act like cues, triggering old emotions and pulling attention backward. The more you engage with these cues, the more your attentional systems remain stuck in the past. A crucial part of redirecting attention is curating your environment so that it supports your future, not your history. Deleting, muting, or distancing from digital triggers is not avoidance. It is attentional hygiene. It is a declaration that your attention belongs to you and it will be invested only where it returns value. The human brain is not just concerned with survival or logic. It is deeply invested in maintaining a coherent sense of self. This sense of identity is constructed over time through memories, values, and most importantly, relationships. When you are closely connected to another person, whether through love, friendship, or even conflict, they become part of your narrative architecture. In neuroscience, this process is governed largely by the default mode network DMN, a group of interconnected brain regions that become highly active during self-referential thinking, introspection, and autobiographical memory. The DMN helps you answer the question, who am I? But here's where it gets complicated. When you detach from someone who has played a significant role in your life, the brain doesn't just feel emotional loss. It experiences identity disruption. This is not simply a matter of sadness or grief. It is a neurological reconfiguration. The stories you've told yourself about who you are in relation to that person, what role they played in your life, and how they made you feel are suddenly invalidated or unresolved. And the DMN, which loves closure and continuity, begins to loop. This looping is why people replay conversations, scroll through old messages, or fantasize about closure. The brain is trying to reconstruct a version of identity that no longer fits reality. From a psychological perspective, the phenomenon is called narrative dissonance. From a neuroscientific view, it's a state of elevated activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, trying to make sense of a change in your internal story. That effort consumes a lot of mental energy. It also explains why people often feel lost, disoriented, or emotionally numb after letting go of someone they deeply cared for. You're not just mourning the person, you're mourning the version of yourself that existed in relation to them. However, this state of disruption, as uncomfortable as it is not permanent. The brain is built for plasticity, neuroplasticity. The brain's ability to change and adapt in response to new experiences is your most powerful tool in reconstructing identity. But this doesn't happen passively. It requires deliberate action, conscious intention, and new inputs. The DMN will keep replaying the old narrative unless you give it a new one. That means stepping into experiences that reinforce a different version of yourself, one not defined by the loss, but by the growth that follows it. One of the most effective ways to do this is through self-authorship. Writing, speaking, or even thinking consciously about who you are becoming activates new neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex. When you say, I am someone who chooses peace, or I am no longer the person who tolerates emotional chaos, you are not just using affirmations, you are programming the brain to update its internal model of you. Repetition of these identity statements, especially when paired with behavior, solidifies the neural pattern. Over time, that new identity becomes more real than the one tied to the person you've let go of. The emotional system of the brain, particularly the amygdala and insula, will resist this process at first. They are built to detect threat and respond to discomfort. Emotional separation from someone familiar, even if toxic, triggers feelings of danger because it challenges the brain's need for predictability. But the way through is not to avoid the pain. It is to retrain the brain to associate uncertainty with opportunity. When you begin to engage in new experiences, trying new routines, meeting new people, setting new goals, you're not just distracting yourself. You are giving the brain new patterns to reinforce. Novelty activates the hippocampus and stimulates dopamine release, both of which support learning and identity change. Another key piece of identity reconstruction is behavior. Cognitive neuroscience consistently shows that behavior changes belief faster than belief changes behavior. If you wait until you feel ready to move on, you may remain stuck for months or years. But if you begin to act like the person you want to become, making decisions aligned with your values, showing up with discipline, choosing your future over your history, the brain begins to update its narrative in real time. The dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which plays a role in social cognition and identity awareness, adapts based on what you consistently do, not what you occasionally think. You also must be mindful of language, both internal and external. Words are not neutral. When you say things like, I'll never get over this, or they were everything to me, you're reinforcing neural loops that keep you stuck. But when you say, I'm evolving, or this is part of becoming who I was meant to be, you are actively reshaping your brain's framework for who you are becoming. Words activate circuits, and circuits create emotional states. If you want to change your identity, start with the language you use to define your experience. Emotional resilience isn't something you're born with or without. It is built, shaped, and strengthened by how you respond to discomfort. The ability to bounce back from emotional setbacks especially after letting go of someone significant, is not merely a trait of strong individuals. It is a measurable adaptation of the brain. And like any adaptation, it requires consistent, intentional effort to develop. Neuroscience shows that emotional pain activates many of the same neural regions as physical pain, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. This overlap explains why heartbreak, rejection, or emotional loss often feels physically painful. The brain doesn't make a strong distinction between a broken bone and a broken bond. But just like the body heals from injury through rest, nutrition, and rehabilitation, the brain can recover from emotional injury through deliberate cognitive training. When someone experiences emotional pain and chooses to face it instead of numbing it or avoiding it, the prefrontal cortex, especially the ventromedial region, engages to reinterpret the situation. This process is called cognitive reappraisal, and it's one of the most effective tools for emotional regulation. It's what allows a person to change their perspective on a breakup from, "I lost everything," to, "This is an opportunity to grow." Practicing reappraisal regularly reshapes the neural circuits involved in emotional processing, making it easier over time to remain grounded when future challenges arise. Resilience also involves controlling the nervous system's response to stress. When someone you care about is no longer in your life, the sympathetic nervous system may go into overdrive. Your heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, thoughts race. This is the classic fight or flight response. But resilience requires access to the parasympathetic system, the one responsible for calming and restoring the body. Practices like slow nasal breathing, cold exposure, and mindfulness meditation train the body to move more easily between these two states. That flexibility is a core aspect of resilience. It's not about being emotionally numb, but about being able to recover quickly from emotional intensity. Another critical factor in resilience is exposure to controlled discomfort. When you intentionally do hard things, whether it's waking up early, engaging in difficult conversations, working out intensely, or sitting quietly with your own thoughts, you're training the brain to tolerate stress. This is known as stress inoculation. It activates the locus coeruleus, a region that releases norepinephrine and is key to alertness and focus. With repeated exposure, your threshold for stress increases and you become less likely to be overwhelmed by emotional triggers. What once felt unbearable now feels manageable, but not because the pain is gone, but because your capacity has grown. It's also important to understand the role of habits in emotional resilience. The brain is a pattern detecting machine, and it relies on routines to conserve energy. If your daily routines constantly bring you back to thoughts of the past, checking old texts, replaying memories, staying idle, then you are reinforcing emotional vulnerability. But if your routines are filled with movement, structure, and meaning, you are reinforcing stability and recovery. Resilience grows through structure because structure creates predictability, and predictability calms the nervous system. Sleep, nutrition, and light exposure play foundational roles in how resilient your brain can be. Sleep, particularly slow wave and REM sleep, is essential for emotional processing. It's when the brain consolidates memories, downregulates emotional intensity, and strengthens coping circuits. Lack of sleep heightens activity in the amygdala, making you more emotionally reactive and less rational. Similarly, proper nutrition, especially nutrients like magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, and B vitamins, supports neurotransmitter balance and helps stabilize mood. Morning exposure to natural light boosts dopamine and cortisol in optimal levels, setting the tone for emotional energy and mental alertness throughout the day. Social support is another variable, but not in the way most people think. Resilience isn't about relying on others to fix your emotions. It's about being connected to people who reinforce your self-efficacy and remind you of who you are outside of emotional pain. Meaningful social interaction activates oxytocin pathways, reducing the stress response and increasing trust in the process of recovery. But those connections must be intentional. Passively scrolling social media or exposing yourself to people who trigger old wounds can delay healing rather than support it. At its core, resilience is about choice. Every moment you face discomfort and decide not to escape it, you're building capacity. Every time you show up for yourself through pain instead of collapsing under it, you're reinforcing circuits that say, I can handle this. Over time, the brain begins to default to those patterns, not because the emotion is absent, but because the response to it has become stronger. Emotional resilience is not denial, It is the outcome of deliberate neurological training that allows you to experience pain without becoming owned by it. The environment you inhabit is not just a backdrop for your life. It is an active, dynamic influencer of your brain's chemistry and function. Every sound, scent, object, space, and interaction carries the potential to trigger specific neural responses. The brain is in constant conversation with its surroundings, scanning for cues of safety, threat, familiarity, novelty, reward, or danger. When you're in the process of letting someone go, whether that's a romantic partner, friend, or anyone deeply tied to your emotions, the environment you stay in can either reinforce healing or anchor you to emotional patterns that slow your growth. From a neuroscientific standpoint, this is tied to associative memory encoding. The hippocampus, which plays a key role in forming and recalling memories, binds emotions and experiences to places and objects. For example, a specific room, sight, or song may trigger a vivid recollection of a moment shared with someone from your past. The amygdala, which governs emotional intensity, enhances these memories, especially if they were emotionally charged. This is why simply walking into a familiar environment or seeing an object tied to a relationship can trigger anxiety, longing, or sadness. These are not just mental habits. They are neural circuits being reactivated by environmental cues. To let go of someone fully, you need to interrupt those circuits. That starts by taking control of your immediate environment. Begin by evaluating your physical space, your room, workspace, digital devices. All of these carry imprints of the past. If your bedroom, for instance, holds physical reminders like photos, clothing, gifts, or even scent cues, your brain associates that space with the emotional history of the person you're trying to detach from. Each time you see or smell these things, it sends a subconscious signal to the brain to reopen those emotional loops. The only way to break that loop is to intentionally recondition the space. Environmental reconditioning means altering your surroundings in a way that signals to your brain, I'm no longer that person. I'm becoming someone new. This could include rearranging furniture, adding new colors, removing sentimental objects, or introducing elements that evoke a sense of growth and clarity, like plants, clean lighting, or art that reflects your current mindset. These aren't aesthetic changes. They're neurological interventions. You're reshaping the way your brain interprets and emotionally responds to space. The digital environment is equally critical. Our phones, social feeds, message threads, and photo albums are often saturated with memories of those we are trying to let go of. Yet we often keep them under the illusion that, need them later or as a form of emotional security. In reality, these digital artifacts are dopaminergic triggers. A single old message or photo can spike dopamine levels, particularly if you're already feeling emotionally depleted. That spike is followed by a crash, reinforcing a cycle of craving and withdrawal. Similar to addiction, by clearing your digital space, archiving chats, removing old pictures, unfollowing or muting, you give your brain fewer reasons to re-engage with those reward craving loops. Light exposure is another environmental factor that powerfully shapes mood and mental clarity. Bright natural light, especially in the early part of the day, stimulates the release of serotonin and dopamine, neurotransmitters associated with focus, motivation, and mood regulation. Dim, cluttered, or chaotic environments, on the other hand, create low-level background stress, elevating cortisol and reducing clarity. If your current environment lacks exposure to natural light or is filled with noise and distractions, your emotional recovery will take longer. Not because you lack willpower, but because your neurochemistry is being shaped by the chaos around you. Auditory cues are often overlooked, but have significant influence. Certain playlists, voice notes, or even background TV shows tied to past experiences can re-trigger emotional memories. The auditory cortex, in tandem with emotional memory centers, binds sound and emotion tightly. So, curating a new soundscape, calming instrumental music, binaural beats, empowering podcasts becomes a strategy to build new emotional associations that reinforce where you are going instead of where you've been. Social environment matters just as much. The people you interact with daily influence your brain's baseline through social resonance, the process by which neural activity syncs up with those around us. If you surround yourself with people who reinforce drama, gossip, or who keep bringing up your past, your nervous system will remain in a reactive, emotionally unstable state. But if you shift your social circle, even slightly, toward people who reflect the version of you that you're becoming, your brain begins to adapt. Mirror neurons fire in response to the emotions and behaviors of others. Being around calm, grounded, forward, moving individuals will train your nervous system to do the same. Your environment is a mirror of your inner world, but it's also a tool you can shape to rewire your brain. When you deliberately alter your surroundings, you're sending signals to your nervous system that change is not only possible, it is happening. This consistent sensory input builds neural pathways through repetition, gradually shifting your emotional baseline from survival and longing to clarity and growth.